Marcus and Chiara were a couple that everyone looked up to with envy and admiration. Marcus, an African-American with incredible business acumen and iron discipline, had risen from poor neighborhoods to own a large construction company. His success story was an inspiration to many hard work, bold decisions, and a flair for lucrative deals made him a millionaire by the age of 35. His company erected skyscrapers in the heart of the city, and Marcus himself became one of the most respected and influential people in the business world. Chiara, his wife, was the epitome of beauty and grace. Slender, with flawless features and glowing skin, she could have been a model or an actress, but she chose a life away from the cameras and the hustle and bustle of society. Chiara had a passion for interior design, and her projects impressed with her exquisite taste and attention to detail. She was the perfect companion for Marcus, intelligent, beautiful, and supportive in all his endeavors. Their marriage seemed perfect. They loved each other, built a life together, and enjoyed the fruits of their labor. They lived in a luxurious mansion in a prestigious area of the city, surrounded by greenery and silence. Every corner of their home was imbued with care and attention, reflecting their life together. Recently, however, Marcus began to notice that something had changed. Chiara had become different, less open, more aloof. She no longer greeted him with a smile at the doorstep, as she used to, and increasingly found excuses to slip away from conversation. One evening when Marcus came home from work, he felt that strange sense of alienation again. Chiara was sitting in the living room with a glass of wine, her gaze staring out the window and her face expressing something indefinable: sadness or perhaps fatigue. Marcus walked over to her and touched her shoulder, trying to get her attention back.
Chiara, how was your day?
He asked softly, sitting down next to her. She broke away from her thoughts and looked up at him, but her smile was strained.
It was fine, Marcus. It's business as usual,
she replied, avoiding his gaze. Marcus felt the chill in her words. They used to be able to discuss the past day for hours, sharing thoughts and plans. But now every conversation they had was short, as if Chiara was no longer willing or able to share her life with him.
Are you sure you're okay? You've been kind of different lately.
He couldn't hide the worry in his voice. Chiara hesitated for a moment, as if considering what to say. She took a sip of wine, then slowly rose from the couch.
It's all right, Marcus. Just a lot to do, a lot to think about,
she said, heading for the door. He stared after her, feeling the invisible wall growing between them more and more. Something was happening, and Marcus could feel it. The question was, what exactly? Their relationship used to be simple and straightforward. They trusted each other. They weren't afraid to talk about their worries. Now Chiara was shutting herself off from him, and that worried him more and more. The first warning signs began to appear about a month ago. That was when Marcus noticed that Chiara was spending more time away from home. She said she was out with friends, doing design work or just going out, but her explanations were vague, and Marcus sensed there was something lurking behind it. Her phone was always on silent mode, and she clearly didn't want him to see her correspondences or know who she was talking to. Time passed, and Marcus's suspicions grew. He tried not to show his unease, but jealousy tormented him inside. Perhaps it was all just a figment of his imagination, paranoia, but he couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong. Meetings with friends that used to bring him joy now made him irritated and anxious. In every man who socialized with Chiara, he saw a potential rival. One evening, when the two of them were having dinner, Marcus decided to have a frank conversation.
Chiara, we need to talk.
He began, placing his fork on the table.
I feel like something has changed between us. You've become different. I want to know what's going on.
Chiara looked at him, her face expressing confusion and maybe a little fear. She knew that this conversation was bound to happen sooner or later, but she wasn't ready for it.
Marcus, it's hard for me to explain.
She looked away, trying to find the words.
I just feel lost. I've been thinking a lot lately about our life, about myself. I don't know how to put it.
Lost?
He frowned, not understanding.
You make it sound like we're not together anymore. We're a team. We've always worked things out together. What's changed?
Nothing in particular. Or all at once.
Chiara sighed and put her hands in her lap, avoiding his gaze.
I feel like I don't know what I want. It's all so confusing.
Marcus could feel his anxiety growing. Chiara's words only increased his suspicions. Perhaps she was indeed going through a crisis, but there was something in her words that made him uneasy. Her answers were evasive. She didn't want to talk about what was really going on in her mind.
Chiara. Now,
He spoke softer, trying to soften her tension.
I love you. We've been through a lot together, and I want to help you if you're not feeling well. But I need to know the truth. If something is wrong, if something is bothering you, you need to tell me.
She froze, but then slowly shook her head.
Marcus, I don't want you to worry. These are my private thoughts, my worries. I'm just trying to sort myself out. Maybe I need some time to do that.
Those words calmed Marcus down a little, but only on the surface. On the inside, he was tormented by doubts. He began to wonder what was really going on with his wife. Maybe it was just a crisis in the relationship that many couples go through. Or maybe it was something more serious. But until he had proof, he couldn't openly accuse her or voice his suspicions. So several weeks passed, and Marcus's anxiety only grew worse. Chiara continued to grow distant, and he continued to try to figure out what the cause was. He began to notice little things that hadn't caught his eye before new things that appeared on Chiara's person, even though she said she was just taking a walk, her frequent late returns, which she attributed to being busy. Marcus tried to keep his cool, but an inner voice told him that these weren't just his fantasies. Doubts were slowly but surely eroding his confidence. After weeks filled with anxiety and doubt, Marcus finally realized he could no longer stand by and just watch his marriage slowly crumble. He had to do something to uncover the truth. But how to do so without Chiara suspecting his intentions? He didn't want to openly accuse her of cheating on him without proof. All he had were doubts and suspicions, but his intuition told him that those doubts were not unfounded. Marcus began to think of various ways he could test his wife's fidelity. He needed a situation that would force her to show her true intentions without suspecting she was being watched. After several sleepless nights and a lot of thought, he finally found a solution, a plan that was as cunning as it was risky. He decided to fake a car accident and pretend that he had lost his eyesight in the accident. The plan was risky, but Marcus felt it was the only way to find out the truth. He realized that such a decision was cruel to Chiara, but his doubts and jealousy were stronger. He couldn't go on living in ignorance. He was consumed with the desire to find out if Chiara was really cheating on him. Marcus began his preparations. He contacted one of his friends who worked as a doctor and arranged for him to help him fake losing his sight. It wasn't an easy conversation, but the friend understood Marcus's desperation and agreed to help. Everything was carefully planned. The accident was to take place in a place where there were no security cameras and at a time that no one could witness. That evening, when everything was going to happen, Marcus felt unusually tense. He drove his car down an empty street, knowing that a simulated collision lay ahead of him. At the last moment, he jerked the steering wheel sharply, and the car veered off the road, crashing into a guardrail. Marcus was wearing his seatbelt and knew in advance that the crash would be mild, but the appearance looked impressive. When Chiara got the call about the accident, she was shocked. She could hear the alarm in the caller's voice, and she immediately rushed to the hospital. When she entered the room, her heart was racing with fear and excitement. Marcus was lying on a hospital bed with his eyes bandaged, his face expressing weakness and helplessness. In the room was a doctor, a friend of Marcus, who was in charge of the whole process. Chiara ran over to her husband's bed, her hands trembling and tears in her eyes.
Marcus, honey, how are you?
Her voice trembling, she grabbed his hand. He slowly turned his head in her direction, pretending to try to focus on her face, though his eyes were covered by a blindfold.
Chiara. Doubt.
He whispered softly.
I can't see anything.
Chiara felt the ground go from under her feet. She looked at the doctor, trying to see if it was true.
Doctor, what's wrong with him? Why can't he see anything? Will it go away?
Her voice was full of despair. The doctor, who was well aware of Marcus' plan, sighed and shook his head.
We've done everything we can, but unfortunately, the optic nerves have been damaged by the injury. Right now, it's hard to say if the vision will be restored. It takes time and a lot of care to see what happens next.
Chiara turned pale. She couldn't believe what was happening. Only a few hours ago she had been sure of her life, and now her husband lay blind and helpless. Tears streaming down her cheeks, she clutched Marcus' hand tightly, as if she was afraid he would disappear.
Marcus, I'm here. It's going to be okay. We're going to make it through this. I'll take care of you,
she said, trying to make her voice sound confident despite her inner fear. Marcus closed his eyes under the blindfold, pretending to be in pain. His heart was pounding with guilt, but he knew he had to follow through.
Kiara? Me?
He spoke again, his voice weak and slightly trembling.
I don't want to be a burden to you. I can't work anymore. I can't see. Maybe you'll be better off without me?
Her eyes widened in horror at the thought that he could think that.
What are you talking about, Marcus?
She exclaimed, snuggling closer to him.
I will never leave you. We'll get through this together. We'll get through this, do you hear me? I love you, and that's the most important thing.
Her words sounded sincere, but doubt still swarmed in Marcus's mind. He knew that the real test was yet to come, and only time would tell if she would really remain faithful to him in this difficult moment. The first days after the accident were a trial for Chiara. She almost never left Marcus' side, trying to be by his side every minute. She helped him with everything from trivial household things to moral support. At first, Marcus even began to doubt the correctness of his suspicions. Chiara seemed so sincere and devoted that he began to feel remorse for having organized this whole show. A few days later, however, Marcus noticed the first worrying signs. Chiara began to look tired and tense, and the enthusiasm with which she had supported her husband in the early days began to fade. She began to leave the house more often under the pretext of meeting friends or going to work. Marcus pretended not to notice, but his suspicions returned with renewed vigor. He listened to her footsteps, felt when she sat on the edge of the bed before leaving, and the tension in her voice when she explained why she had been away for so long again. One evening, when Chiara came home later than usual, Marcus decided to speak up.
Kiara. Mand.
He began, trying to make his voice sound as helpless as possible.
You've started leaving so often. Do you really have to work so much? It's really hard for me without you.
Chiara faltered for a moment, her heart clenched with guilt. She really felt that Marcus was having a hard time alone, but at the same time she couldn't stand to be in an atmosphere of constant tension anymore. She felt trapped in their home, where everything was a reminder that her husband could no longer live a fulfilling life.
Marcus, I understand how hard this is for you,
she replied, trying to find the right words.
But I need some time to myself too. I can't be around all the time. I have to think about myself too. I love you, but I need some space.
Those words seemed to confirm Marcus' worst fears. He felt Chiara begin to distance herself even more, and he couldn't tell if it was because of his blindness or something else. He realized that he couldn't openly ask without arousing suspicion, but inwardly he was torn at the thought that his wife could only be with him out of pity. A few more days passed, and Chiara began to linger outside the house more often. She said she was out with friends, that she needed a distraction, but Marcus could hear something new in her voice, an elusive note of detachment, as if she was no longer mentally with him. He knew his plan was probably too cruel, but it was too late to backtrack. Now he had to go through with it and find out the truth. The first few days after the staged accident that caused Marcus to lose his sight were a real ordeal for him. Despite his careful preparation and well-thought-out plan, it was extremely difficult for him to act as if he were actually blind. Everyday mundane tasks that had seemed insignificant before now required a tremendous amount of effort on his part. He had to feign helplessness, be careful not to give himself away with a single awkward movement or word. It required concentration, attention to detail, and constant control over his emotions. Kyra, shaken by what had happened, took on the full care of her husband. She became his eyes, helped him get around the house, cooked, fed him, and supported him in his most difficult moments. In the first days after the accident, her devotion and love seemed unwavering. She never left Marcus' side, trying to ease his suffering and give him confidence that they would get through the ordeal. Chiara was not only physically but also mentally by his side, supporting him in moments of despair and inspiring hope for a better future. However, despite her apparent care and attention, Marcus continued to observe her behavior. Doubts and jealousy were still simmering inside him. At first, his suspicions began to dull slightly. Her concern seemed genuine, and he even began to doubt the validity of his plan. Maybe he had been wrong. and Chiara had been faithful to him. Perhaps it was all just a figment of his jealousy, and he was harboring these suspicions for nothing. But as the weeks passed, Marcus noticed the first disturbing changes in his wife's behavior. At first they were subtle, almost imperceptible, but as time went on they became more and more obvious. Chiara was beginning to grow tired. She was increasingly irritable in her actions, less attentive to him, though she still tried to appear caring and loving. Previously, every meeting with her friends had been discussed and planned in detail, but now she began to disappear from the house without warning. Chiara's excuses were that she needed some time to herself, that she wanted to meet her friends or do some work. But these explanations seemed less and less convincing to Marcus. She left more and more often in the evenings, returning late, sometimes even in the morning. Marcus pretended not to notice these changes, continuing to play the helpless blind man, but inwardly he became more and more convinced of his wife's infidelity. Every morning Chiara woke up more and more tired and distant. Her face lost its former softness and her smile became more and more rare. She no longer stayed in the house longer than necessary, nor did she offer to talk or spend time together. More and more often Marcus was alone, immersed in a silence that only intensified his inner torment. Chiara, on the other hand, felt as if she was taking every opportunity to get away from the house, away from this new reality. The house that had once been filled with laughter, conversation, and warmth was now a cold, almost alien place. A space once full of life and energy now seemed empty and oppressive to Marcus. Chiara had stopped caring about the little things that used to occupy her attention. Now she seemed to have become indifferent to how their house looked, what they ate, how they spent their time together. She used to decorate the rooms with flowers, making sure everything was perfect. Now her care for the house seemed formal, as if she did it only out of obligation, rather than desire. As time went on, Chiara began to talk less and less to Marcus. Their once long and deep conversations that they had had in the evenings had all but died down. She began to avoid talking about the future, reluctant to discuss plans for their future lives. It seemed as if she no longer saw the point in these conversations, as if their future together had ceased to exist in her mind. Chiara began to avoid Marcus even physically. Her touches, previously so frequent and tender, became infrequent and superficial. Marcus continued to find blindness, but a sense of hopelessness was growing inside him. On the one hand, he was ready for Chiara to betray him, but on the other hand, he couldn't fully believe it was really happening. He wanted to believe that she still loved him, that her detachment was only a temporary reaction to stress and worry. But her increasingly frequent absences from home, her coldness and indifference told a different story. Sometimes, alone in the silence of his house, Marcus caught himself listening to every rustle, every sound, hoping to hear Chiara coming home. But more and more often he encountered a silence that only added to his doubts. In the moments when she was near, Marcus tried to catch a hint of the tenderness in her voice, tried to see if she still cared for him. But her words seemed empty to him, as if she was saying them out of habit, without any real feeling in them. A few more weeks passed, and Marcus began to notice that Chiara was leaving the house more and more often, avoiding to meet his eyes or explain where she was going. She didn't want him to know her business, and it only increased his suspicions. At times like this, Marcus could feel a wave of despair and anger building up inside him. He realized that his plan had reached a point where further inaction would be tantamount to defeat. Chiara seemed to have become a stranger to him. She stopped sharing her thoughts with him, stopped discussing her plans for the future. There were new habits in her life, new people Marcus knew nothing about. All this only increased his feeling that an insurmountable wall had grown between them that was impossible to break down. Marcus felt what had once bound them together slipping away from him. Chiara was no longer the woman he loved, and that realization hurt him. All Marcus could do was continue to watch her behavior, looking for signs of infidelity in her every move. Every time she left the house, every word she said in passing, every look he couldn't see, but could feel, all became part of his internal struggle. It pained him to realize that his plan, conceived to uncover the truth, had led him to lose what he had once considered the most important thing in his life. All this time, Marcus had lived in constant fear and tension, feeling the chasm growing between him and Chiara. He wanted to regain the love and trust that had once bound them together, but he realized that it was becoming less and less possible every day. Living blind not only deprived him of physical sight, but also made him lose faith in his wife, in their future together. The conviction grew stronger and stronger in his soul that Chiara was no longer with him, that her heart belonged to someone else. Week after week, Marcus continued to live as a blind man, sinking deeper and deeper into his suspicions and doubts. He tried to find answers to his questions, tried to figure out what had happened to their marriage, but instead he became more and more confused in his thoughts. His plan, originally conceived as a way to uncover the truth, turned into a source of endless suffering and pain. Living blindly became a nightmare from which he could not escape. Several weeks passed as Marcus continued his staging, and the situation between him and Chiara became increasingly tense. He noticed that her concern, which had once seemed genuine and full of love, had become superficial and on duty. She disappeared from home more and more often, arriving late and looking more and more distant. But the real shock awaited him when he began to notice the first clear signs of infidelity. Marcus had never been paranoid, but his jealousy and suspicion reached a new level after one of those nights when Chiara came home later than usual. He was lying in his bedroom pretending to sleep, but his hearing had sharpened to the breaking point. Chiara came into the room, but instead of going straight to bed, she walked to the kitchen where Marcus heard her talking quietly on the phone. He strained to catch a word of her conversation, but she was speaking too quietly and curtly. All he could hear was the name Derek. It was like a lightning bolt through his mind. Derek was his friend, one of the people he had always trusted. As the days passed, Marcus began to notice more and more suspicious details. He tried to keep up the appearance of his blindness, but it was getting harder every day. At times it seemed to him that Chiara was purposely testing him for reactions, seeing how he behaved if he showed any suspicion. She locked herself in the bathroom with the phone more often, her conversations shorter and shorter, but there was a tenderness and excitement in her voice that she no longer showed toward him. One day, when Marcus was alone at home again, he accidentally discovered Chiara's cell phone, which she had forgotten in the kitchen. His heart raced as he realized it was a chance to find answers to the questions that had been tormenting him. He didn't want to open her phone, knowing it was a step from which there would be no turning back, but his suspicions and pain were stronger. He found her text messages with Derek. It was filled with romantic confessions, promises of reunions, and photos that were never meant to be seen by strangers. In that moment, Marcus felt his world crumbling. Everything was falling into place now. Her frequent absences, her late returns, her aloofness and coldness were all the result of her affair with Derek. A man Marcus trusted, a man he once would have trusted to do anything. The betrayal of Chiara and Derek had been a double blow to him. He felt devastated, betrayed and humiliated. It was hard to believe that the woman he had spent so many years with could cheat on him in such cold blood, thinking he didn't notice anything because of his blindness. Marcus began to notice how often Chiara left the house, claiming she had to meet friends or work. He knew that every disappearance of hers now had to do with Derek. She believed he suspected nothing, that his blindness had completely isolated him from the real world. That knowledge made her even more reckless. She no longer hid her feelings, certain that Marcus was incapable of picking up on these changes. One evening, when she was once again lingering outside the house, Marcus heard her coming back in. But instead of going straight to him, Chiara, thinking he was asleep, quietly walked to the balcony and started calling Derek. Her voice was full of tenderness, something he hadn't heard in their communication in a long time. She whispered words that were previously meant for him. In that moment, Marcus realized how deeply she was already involved with another man. Her voice, her laughter, it was all addressed to Derek, his former friend. Chiara and Derek began to see each other more often, and with less precautions. She believed that since Marcus couldn't see anything, he wouldn't be able to understand anything. He pretended to continue to be blind and not notice anything, even though a storm was raging inside him. Her lies had become obvious, her cheating obvious. He couldn't believe that she had so easily betrayed their past together, their love, everything they had built together over the years. Now her words and actions when they were together seemed empty and false to him. Every new piece of evidence, every mention of Derek's name in her conversations or correspondence was a new blow to Marcus. His heart was torn between anger and pain. He felt cheated not only by his wife, but also by his friend. Derek, a man he trusted, had betrayed him in the lowest possible way by starting an affair with his wife. This infidelity had shattered all his notions of friendship, trust and love. With each passing week, the situation grew worse. Chiara stopped pretending even in front of him. She no longer tried to be a caring wife. Her support became formal and indifferent. She spent less and less time at home, and when she was there, her thoughts were clearly far away. Her presence was becoming a mere shadow of the former love they had once shared. Marcus, for his part, tried not to show that he knew the truth. He continued to play the role of the blind man in order to gather all possible evidence of infidelity. He needed to be sure that his suspicions were correct, that it wasn't just a play of imagination. But each new day brought him more and more evidence that Chiara was long gone from him, that her heart belonged to someone else. Her phone conversations with Derek became more and more explicit, her meetings with him more and more frequent. She began to bring home signs of her infidelity, not realizing that Marcus saw everything and knew everything. He heard her conversations, smelled the scent of other people's perfume on her clothes, noticed the change in her behavior after each meeting with Derek. She stopped hiding her connection, confident that Marcus wouldn't find out. At some point, Marcus realized he couldn't take it anymore. It pained him to realize that the woman he loved was capable of such betrayal. He felt his love and trust in her dissolve into hatred and contempt. But he couldn't just end it all. He needed to understand how far she was willing to go, how far their betrayal went. He began to notice that her behavior had become even more careless. Chiara was no longer trying to maintain the illusion of caring. She left her phone in plain sight. She didn't hide her correspondence. Her meetings with Derek became regular. She stopped caring that Marcus didn't suspect anything amiss. In her mind, he was completely blind and helpless, unable to see or understand what was going on around him. Marcus felt that their life had become a farce, that he could no longer continue this game. But at the same time, he realized that it would take time to reveal everything to the end. He couldn't just expose her without having all the evidence in hand. He needed to make sure that when he revealed himself, she wouldn't be able to deny her actions. Each new morning began for Marcus with the realization that he was living in a world of lies and betrayal. Each new day brought him more pain and suffering. Chiara continued her meetings with Derek, unaware that Marcus saw everything, heard everything, and knew everything. And she lived in the certainty that her secret would remain a secret, that her husband would forever remain in the dark. But Marcus could no longer remain indifferent. His heart was torn to pieces, his trust destroyed. He realized that the moment would soon come when he could no longer hide the truth, when his patience would run out. But for now, he continued to play his part, gathering every possible evidence of treason. He needed to know how deep their treachery went before he would reveal his truth to them. Marcus felt that his patience was running out. Each new day brought him more pain and suffering, increasing his hatred and contempt for Chiara and Derek. He could no longer tolerate their deception and betrayal. Thoughts were forming in his head about how he could end this painful game that he had started himself. Marcus knew that the end was near, and that soon he would have to reveal all the cards. The plan of exposure matured in his mind gradually. He understood that it was not enough to expose them just like that. He needed not only to convict Chiara of treason, but to do it in such a way that both she and Derek felt the full weight of their betrayal. Marcus knew he had to arrange everything so that they couldn't justify themselves or get out of it. He wanted this moment to be unforgettable for them, so that they would remember it for the rest of their lives. He began to carefully plan everything down to the smallest detail. It was important not only how he would reveal his lies, but also when. He wanted to take them by surprise, at the moment of their greatest confidence in their safety. The thought was forming in Marcus's mind that the best way to expose them was to arrange for Derek to come to their house. He knew that at this moment their feelings and emotions would be most naked, and their reaction would be as sincere as possible. Marcus was waiting for the right moment. He kept track of when Chiara and Derek could meet at their house. One evening, when Chiara, as usual, went to meet her friends, he heard her arranging with Derek to come to their house. They planned to meet late at night, when Marcus was already asleep. This moment seemed perfect to him. He knew this was his chance to reveal everything and put an end to their lies. Marcus had carefully prepared for this evening. He provided everything so that his exposure would go smoothly. He thought through every step, every detail, so that the moment of his recovery would be a real shock to them. Marcus knew that this moment would be unexpected for them, and this was the key to his plan. He wanted them to realize the depth of their betrayal and realize that he had known about their betrayal all along. When evening came, Marcus pretended to go to bed earlier than usual. He wanted Chara and Derek to think that everything was going according to their plan. He could hear Chara talking quietly to Derek on the phone, making an appointment. Marcus lay in bed, holding his breath and concentrating on not giving away his intentions. He knew that he had to remain calm and cool despite the storm of emotions that was raging inside him. After a while, Chara came out of the bedroom, ostensibly to check if everything was okay, and Marcus heard her quietly open the door, letting Derek into the house. They spoke in whispers, laughing and discussing something that was only available to the two of them. At that moment, Marcus felt anger building inside him. They really believed that he could be so easily deceived that he would remain in the dark forever. But he knew that their joy and confidence would soon be destroyed. Marcus gave them time to calm down and fully immerse themselves in their false sense of security. Then he began to act. Quietly getting out of bed, he went to the bedroom door and opened it a crack, watching what was happening in the living room. Chiara and Derek were sitting on the couch, close to each other, deep in conversation. There was a passion in their eyes that had not been in Marcus and Chiara's relationship for a long time. Marcus slowly approached them, but they did not notice him. At that moment, he felt his heart pounding with adrenaline. His whole plan, everything he had in mind, had to come to life right now. And so, when he was a few steps away from them, he said loudly, "What's going on here?" Chiara and Derek jumped in surprise. Chiara turned to him with her eyes wide open in horror, and Derek, pale, stared at him, unable to utter a word. There was bewilderment and fear in their gazes. Marcus took a step forward and, looking straight into their eyes, said, "It seems my eyesight has returned, and now I see everything much more clearly." This moment turned out to be a real shock for them. Chiara couldn't believe that her husband, who in her opinion was blind, was standing in front of her, seeing everything that was happening. She tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. Derek, on the other hand, froze, realizing that all their lies and betrayal had become obvious. Fear appeared in his eyes, mixed with guilt and shame. Marcus took another step forward, still glaring at them. He saw new emotions appear on their faces: panic, shame, helplessness. All this time they thought they were in control of the situation, but now the realization of their situation hit them like a hammer. Chiara tried to take a step back, as if hoping to hide from his gaze, but Marcus did not give her the opportunity. He continued to speak, his voice getting louder and more confident. His words contained all the pain that had accumulated during this time, all the hatred and contempt that he felt for both of them. Marcus accused them of hypocrisy, of daring to betray his trust. His every word hit them like a blow, destroying the last remnants of their confidence. Chiara tried to find an excuse, but all her attempts were in vain. Derek, standing next to her, seemed broken. He realized that their plan had completely failed. Marcus didn't give them time to recover. He continued to denounce them, revealing all the details of how he pretended to be blind, how he watched their betrayal, and how he planned this moment. He talked about how hard it was for him to see how the woman he loved cheated on him with his friend, and how this betrayal tore his heart to pieces. He wanted them to understand the depth of his pain and suffering, to realize that their betrayal was the biggest blow in his life. Chiara and Derek stood in front of him, realizing that they had nothing more to say. Their secrets have been revealed, their lies have been exposed. Now they were completely vulnerable to Marcus, who was no longer blind and helpless. He saw them for what they really are: traitors who ruined his life. Marcus knew that their relationship was over, but this realization did not bring him relief. He felt bitterness and devastation, because everything he had once loved and appreciated had been destroyed. He saw before him the woman he had shared his life with, and the friend he trusted, but now they were strangers. Marcus knew that nothing would be the same after that. He left them standing in the living room, realizing the depth of his defeat. He knew that their lives would never be the same, that he would never be able to forget what they had done. Marcus left the room, leaving them in a state of shock and fear. He knew that this moment would haunt them for the rest of their lives, as it would haunt him. Marcus left, leaving them alone with their shame and guilt. He didn't want to see their faces anymore, didn't want to hear their excuses. He knew that their relationship was over, and nothing else could fix what had happened. All that remained was to accept a new reality in which he would no longer be a part of their lives. At that moment, Marcus realized that his plan had worked, but the price he had paid was too high. He discovered their betrayal, but lost faith in the people he loved. Now he had to start a new life, leaving behind everything that had to do with Chiara and Derek. This evening was the end of his old life, and the beginning of something new, unknown, but inevitable. When Marcus finally revealed his game, the room was instantly filled with a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. There was a tension in the air that could almost be felt physically. Chiara and Derek stood in front of him in a state of shock, as if they couldn't believe what had just happened. Their eyes widened in horror, and their faces turned pale. Their whole world was crumbling right before their eyes. Marcus, seeing their confusion and fear, felt both anger and bitterness. His heart was filled with pain and disappointment, which grew with every second of silence. He knew they were going to hear something they didn't want to hear. But he couldn't and didn't want to hold back anymore. The inner anger that had been accumulating in his soul for a long time demanded an outlet, and this moment became a point of no return for him. He turned his attention to Chiara first. The woman he had once loved now seemed alien and distant to him. Marcus saw her face, and in that face there was no longer the tenderness and care that once bound them. All he saw now was fright and despair. She clearly hadn't expected this turn of events. Her ideal world of lies and betrayal had collapsed in an instant, and now she stood in front of him, not knowing what to do next. Marcus ruthlessly presented Chiara with all the evidence of her infidelity. He told how he had heard her conversations with Derek, how he had seen their correspondence full of hidden hints and frank confessions. He described how, day after day, he watched her leave the house under the pretext of meeting with her friends, knowing that in fact she was going to Derek. All this time, she believed that he did not see or suspect anything, but in fact, her every step was under his close supervision. Chiara stood in front of him, shocked by these revelations. Her hands were shaking, her gaze darted from Marcus to Derek and back again, but she couldn't find the strength to answer. Marcus could see her face gradually losing the remnants of confidence, her eyes filling with tears. But at this moment his heart remained cold. He could no longer feel the compassion for her that he had felt before. Her tears couldn't touch him anymore. For him, she was a symbol of betrayal and lies. Then Marcus turned to Derek. The man he had once considered a friend now looked completely pathetic. Derek stood there, not knowing where to put himself, his face reflecting fear and shame. Marcus presented him with the same evidence as Chiara. He reminded Derek of how he came to his house, secretly met with his wife, thinking that Marcus's blindness would become their shield from exposure. But this shield turned out to be just an illusion, and now Derek was forced to face the truth. Marcus could see Derek trying to hide his panic, but every gesture, every feature of his face betrayed him. There was no longer confidence in his actions, there was no longer a sense of superiority. Derek realized that their deception had been revealed, and now he had to answer for his actions. Marcus didn't hold back, expressing all his hatred and contempt. He couldn't understand how Derek, a man he trusted, could stoop so low, betraying their friendship for the sake of a fleeting passion. At that moment, Chiara tried to find an excuse for her actions. She started to speak, but her words sounded hollow and unconvincing. Marcus could hear the desperation in her voice, but he couldn't see the genuine remorse behind it. Her attempts to explain herself seemed to him only a pathetic attempt to save something that could no longer be saved. Chiara said that she was confused, that her feelings were incomprehensible, but Marcus no longer believed her. Each of her new arguments only added fuel to the fire of his anger. Chiara tried to shift some of the blame to the circumstances, to the difficulties that had arisen in their marriage, to her insecurity. She wanted Marcus to see her from a different angle, so that he would understand her motivation. But he couldn't accept these excuses. For him, cheating was cheating, and no words could change that. He could hear the fear of loss in her voice, but this fear was not caused by guilt, but by fear of the consequences. Marcus saw Chiara and Derek standing in front of him, broken and depressed. Their worlds have been destroyed, their lies exposed, and now they are forced to face the reality they have ignored for so long. But instead of feeling satisfied with his exposure, Marcus felt only a deep emptiness. Everything he had lived for in recent weeks, all his desire to expose them, turned out to be meaningless. He felt neither relief nor satisfaction. Only pain and disappointment filled his heart. Marcus realized that their relationship would never be able to get back on track. He lost faith in the people he once trusted the most. Chara and Derek were not just close people to him, but those with whom he built his life, with whom he shared his dreams and plans. And now they've ruined everything they had together, turning his life into a nightmare. When Chara realized that her words were not resonating in Marcus's heart, she fell silent. Her face contorted in pain, and she lowered her eyes, realizing that there was no point in continuing to speak anymore. Marcus stood in front of them, feeling his inner world finally collapse. He knew that after this evening, his life would never be the same. Derek, unable to stand the tension, took a step back, as if trying to escape from everything that was happening. But Marcus wouldn't let him go. He reminded him of who they were to each other, that the friendship they had built over the years was now ruined because of his betrayal. Marcus did not choose words, expressing everything that had accumulated in his soul. He saw how Derek was trying to find at least some words in response, but each time he stopped, realizing that it was useless. Everything that could have been said has already been said. Chara, standing next to him, looked absolutely broken. Her eyes were full of tears, and she no longer tried to justify herself. Everything inside her collapsed, just like in Marcus's life. She knew that she could no longer get back what they had lost. All her attempts to explain her actions only increased Marcus's pain and despair, making the gap between them even more obvious and insurmountable. Marcus was aware that this confrontation would not bring him peace. He did not feel like a winner, although he had achieved his goal. He just stood in front of them, seeing how the lives of all three had been destroyed. Everything they had, everything that connected them, has now disappeared, leaving only ruins. This moment was the final conclusion of their past, with no hope of returning to what it once was. When the confrontation came to an end, Marcus felt that he had nothing more to say. All the words have already been said, all the charges have been filed. He saw Chara and Derek standing in front of him, not knowing what to do next, as their faces reflected all the pain and shame they were now forced to bear. But he no longer cared about their feelings. He knew that he needed to leave to start his life anew, without them. Marcus turned and walked out of the room, leaving them behind in their world of shattered hopes and shattered illusions. There was only emptiness inside him, but he knew that this was the beginning of something new. His life would never be the same again, but he was ready for it. Now he had to find a way to himself, to a new life, free from the betrayal and lies that had accompanied him in recent weeks. After Marcus completed his confrontation with Chara and Derek, he felt that he was on the verge of an irreversible decision. Their entire marriage, all the years they had spent together, now seemed to him like a lie, tainted by betrayal and deception. Broken trust left him lonely and devastated. The realization was maturing inside him that their relationship would never be able to return to its former course. The time spent trying to save something that has already died would be in vain. Marcus knew that the only way out of this maze of pain and suffering was to break up. When he returned to the bedroom, all the memories of the happiness he and Chara had once shared seemed distant and alien. The bed, which used to be a symbol of their closeness and love, was now perceived as a reminder of how much everything had changed. Marcus knew that every day he stayed in this house, he would sink deeper into a pool of despair and disappointment. He could no longer live in this world of lies, where every corner reminded them of what they had lost. Marcus made his decision quickly and decisively. He knew that by staying in this marriage, he would only continue to experience pain that he could no longer bear. Chara, although she tried to justify herself, knew deep down that nothing could be fixed. She looked at him with eyes full of fear and despair, but no longer tried to stop him. She understood that she had gone too far, that her actions had destroyed their family, and now she had to live with these consequences. Marcus packed his things in silence, trying not to get emotional. He didn't want to see Chara's tears, didn't want to hear her pleas or excuses. Everything about her was now a source of pain, and he knew he had to put it behind him in order to find the strength to start over. The process of collecting things was painful for him, but at the same time cleansing. With each item he packed, he felt like he was gradually getting rid of the burden of the past, of memories that no longer mattered. When Marcus finished, he left the house that had once been his refuge without a word. He felt the door closing behind him, leaving everything connected with Chiara behind. Now his path was ahead, and he wasn't going to look back. At that moment, Marcus realized that he had left not only the house, but also the part of himself that was connected to Chiara and their shared past. Derek, realizing that his presence in this house had become unbearable for both Chiara and himself, also decided to leave. He realized that he could no longer be a part of her life, that their relationship was built on false foundations and doomed to failure. The betrayal they committed destroyed not only their friendship with Marcus, but also themselves. Derek felt that the only right thing to do was to leave Chiara alone with her choices and the consequences. With Marcus leaving home, a new chapter in his life began. At first, it was difficult for him to cope with the feeling of loneliness and loss that came after the breakup. He realized that he could no longer return to his old life, that everything that had happened up to that moment was in the past. But gradually, Marcus began to find the strength to move on. He focused on his work, on his personal interests, which previously seemed unimportant, but now have become a source of comfort and inspiration for him. Marcus realized that in order to fully heal, he needed not only to forget about Chiara and Derek, but also to forgive them. Forgiveness did not mean reconciliation or a return to the past, but it was necessary in order to get rid of the burden of resentment and start living anew. This process took time, but every day Marcus felt his soul getting lighter. He understood that he no longer depended on the actions of others, that his future was now in his hands. Over time, Marcus realized that this whole situation had taught him an important lesson. He realized that trust is the foundation of any relationship, and that without it there can be no real intimacy and love. He also realized that ignoring his own suspicions could lead to devastating consequences, but he vowed to himself never to resort to such drastic methods of checking relationships again. It was a dangerous game in which he lost much more than he won. Now Marcus knew that a real relationship was built on trust, openness, and honesty. He decided that in the future he would be more attentive to his feelings and intuition, but also learn how to talk with a partner, solve problems together, without resorting to manipulation and tricks. This experience has made him stronger, wiser, and ready for a new relationship that he could build on stronger foundations. The final part of his story was the beginning of a new life for him, free from lies and betrayal. Marcus found the strength to let go of the past and start over with a clean slate. He knew that there were many challenges ahead of him, but now he was ready for them. Past experience had taught him to value trust and honesty above all else, and he was ready to apply this lesson in his new life. Marcus understood that in the future he would build his relationship differently, based on respect and understanding, so that he would never repeat the mistakes of the past.